So basically, this talk kind of takes, it's a kind of walk up the main street in West Linton, kind of starting at the bottom, down at the kind of Broomley Camp side of West Linton, and then going up one side of the main street and coming back. But don't worry, because it's not too big a main street, so I won't be keeping you here till like midnight or something like that, kind of going up and down. And it's just a kind of look at mainly kind of around the 40s and 50s, talking about what the village looked like then, but also kind of looking back a little bit as well, because it's quite a kind of thriving village in terms of like businesses and things like that, a lot of which have kind of closed down now or aren't there anymore. So it's a kind of look over that, just kind of over the kind of that kind of era, kind of mid last century basically. And the kind of reason that I kind of decided to do the talk for the kind of Historical Association in West Linton was just to kind of like talk to some people around about the village about some of the memories and things like that had actually, you know, just to get some kind of living memories about things that had happened, and just to kind of like give a good bit of a kind of more of a social history rather than a textbook history, because you know things are very dry sometimes when they're written down, but the kind of the context round about them is sometimes all when you're actually talking about that kind of stuff. So that's kind of why I kind of decided that I would do the talk for the Historical Association. Plus, to be fair, there was nobody else that wanted to do a talk that month either, so I kind of got press ganged into it a bit as well. So that was kind of another reason for doing it. So kind of, as I say, kind of starting at the bottom of the village, kind of coming in from the south, basically as if you were coming in from the kind of Peebles end, up past Broomley Camp, for people that know it, and into West Linton. And the kind of picture there shows probably what was quite a typical scene of the village roundabout, the kind of very early 1900s, where the majority of West Linton was really very, very rural, and pretty much just a number of kind of farms that were kind of hooked together with, you know, some houses around looking, you know, houses from that point of view, kind of farmhouses and things like that, but quite large acreages of open ground. And the picture there of that is a kind of postcard showing the kind of entrance into the village with the church and what is now the manse to kind of orientate you as to where you actually are. And the kind of picture there of the field with the haystacks in it is probably where Line View is, for people that know West Linton, the kind of 4 houses at the bottom of Broomley Crescent. And going down there is pretty much all farmland. So Broomley Crescent and Broomley Road only really started to be built kind of about the 1930s, and there was no kind of fire station or anything like that at that point in West Linton. It was very, very, very rural, and there was still loads of open ground that was used for agriculture coming into West Linton. If we then kind of move a little bit, sorry, I'm in the wrong one. So, oh, what's happened there? A minute. Sorry, just going to get in a bit out of sync. So basically coming into the village, there was the first thing you kind of see is a kind of a toll house basically coming in, where there's the old toll where there used to be, it's now a kind of tea room, and that's kind of roundabout where the split is into the green basically. That used to be very much a kind of a living house, as it were. It was a house which somebody actually lived in. It used to be the janitor for the school that lived in there, which my mother remembers. And it was a kind of one-roomed house with a range and a hole-in-the-wall bed. That kind of thing was being used well into the kind of, you know, 1940s and 50s as a house, a real house, and not just something that was used for, now it's a kind of a tea room. It isn't a kind of tea room, it is a tea room. And that was used then as a real house with, you know, the kind of toilet outside, the sink inside the front door, very much a kind of small house that was basic, but was what people were actually living in. And then kind of moving a bit further up the village into kind of the area where the fire station is now. This map that you can see, that shows a kind of area in West Linton where there was a big market garden basically. So the bit that says market garden on that map is where the fire station in West Linton is now. And that at that time was, as you can see, a big market garden with glass houses as well as cultivated land. If you look at the valuation rolls for the area kind of round about the kind of mid-century, it indicates there was like glass houses and all that on that land. So there was a kind of real market garden area in that area of West Linton, extending right up to where, for people that know West Linton, Croft Square is. So Croft Square, as the name might indicate, was like a kind of crofting area. With it also had a market garden on it, and it was owned by the whole kind of area was owned by the millers, who kind of grew vegetables, sold vegetables and fruit and stuff like that from that area. So there was quite a kind of thriving kind of local industry in actually delivering vegetables and that, you know, grown in the village to the people that actually lived in the village. And then that's all kind of like now been kind of knocked down and is all houses. But it's quite kind of interesting how people are now talking about, you know, coming back to growing their own and growing in local areas. But, you know, at that time, you know, kind of last century, that's exactly what people were doing in the village. They were actually growing their own food and selling it from within the village area. So you kind of, it's almost like coming full circle now into, you know, what we're trying to do now from what was then. So that was kind of like moving kind of up through the village. We then, this kind of shows this kind of whole market garden area, Spelthurst being where the manse is, but that whole area that you can see shows kind of the extent of where the market garden was likely to be, right down to the kind of almost down to where Broomley Crescent is now. So it was a very kind of large area. Moving on from there, kind of further up the village, we're kind of coming into where the kind of the proper main street of the village, up where past the War Memorial and up into where the shops start. And here we're kind of moving into the kind of houses and shops of the West Linton. So one of the first, all these kind of areas now, they've all pretty much been turned into houses. But even when I was growing up, coming into West Linton, there was a fruit shop which was owned by Mr. Slimming. Prior to that, before 1939, it was owned by Mr. Cunningham, apparently, who had a parrot, allegedly, an alleged parrot that was kept in the shop, and it kind of apparently said that it would shout out when somebody came into the shop to allow Mr. Cunningham to basically go through the back and have a cup of tea or something like that while he was waiting on a customer. And that's all now been made into, it's called Grocer's Cottage now in West Linton. That's been changed into just a house now, but up to kind of late 80s, probably early 90s, that was a shop as well. Mr. Slimming stayed down at the near Broomley camp in the kind of station, where the station used to be in West Linton, and he had 4 daughters, and before who are all dead now basically, but Agnes Slimming, and she died a couple of years ago. Just before she died, during COVID, I actually managed to get her son to do a bit of kind of recording of some oral history with her, basically, just to get some kind of information about stuff that had happened in that kind of era when she was growing up. And one of the kind of interesting things that she said was that one, she used to, when you think about what people are scared to do now, she used to get driven to Leadburn and put on a train to go down to People's High School when she was quite young, on her own basically, and coming back and getting picked up at Leadburn again. But 2, she was left the school at 16 and she started driving the fruit van. There was a fruit van that delivered fruit and veg from her father's shop, and she was out in all weathers, and she said people were amazed that this 16-year-old could basically drive this fruit van out and about, going around delivering to people round about West Linton. She also, which I didn't know, had volunteered to drive the fire tender during the war. Her and her friends had been trained up how to drive the fire tender in the war when people were away. And that's when the fire station was above what was a baker's shop on the Deanfoot Road, which is where you come in down the hill into West Linton and kind of turn first left to go down past where the school is now. That's where the fire station used to be situated. And she was basically out in all weathers doing this kind of stuff. And she sounded a real go-ahead person, basically. It was quite interesting to get that kind of background from somebody that had lived through that era and was basically you know, able, just telling us all the things that she'd done. So that was a really kind of interesting bit of kind of news that we got from her before she unfortunately died. Going a little bit further up into the village, just before the post office, there's a kind of little lane that goes up. And you can see here that there's a kind of, well, it's a garage now. There's a building with a kind of blue up and over door that you can see there. And that was actually a house at some point, and it is, when you look at it, it is absolutely tiny. And apparently at one point there was about 10 people living in that house in the in it before the kind of council and social housing was built in West Linton. So it was the Gordons was the main family that lived in there. My mother remembers them living in there, and there was, I think there was a considerable number of them, maybe not 10, but I don't think it was far off it, living in what is effectively a garage now for a pretty small car. And after that, there was a woman called Maggie Mowbray who then moved in, who was apparently a very kind of poor person. And she then moved in there and lived in there as well. She used to read tea leaves, apparently. Apparently, this is something, a little bit of kind of information that I got from Agnes Slimming, that as part of the kind of rural meetings, because there was a fierce rural that went on in West Linton at that time, she used to kind of do, they used to have a cup of tea at the end, and Maggie Mowbray used to read the tea leaves of everybody in the meeting at the end. That was kind of one of the high spots of the meeting, was getting your tea leaves read. But it's quite incredible when you think about it that, you know, within, I mean, this is living memory, that people were living in basically one room houses with kind of no running water, no toilets or anything like that, which are now converted into small garages, and that's kind of what people were living in West Linton. So quite kind of, well, it makes you think definitely about, you know, the living conditions that people were in. Moving a little bit further up to kind of towards Town Foot and the sweet shop. So Town Foot at the time was a couple of houses. Now Town Foot is also just beside the post office, and for people that know West Linton or know, it was where Mr. Stevenson used to stay, the person that used to give the piano lessons. So that's where they stayed, and that used to be two houses. So there was a stair went up the outside, and then there was a kind of a small house at the top, and then the main house. And that was that's now been taken away, so that's not there anymore. It's just been converted into one property. And where the post office now is, that used to be a couple of shops that was converted into a cafe and a sweet shop. And you'll find out that West Linton had an incredible amount of sweet shops in the kind of this era. It was unbelievable, actually. But it's been kind of knocked into one shop now. So there was a kind of small cafe and a sweet shop, and that was kind of run by I can't remember what the people's name were. It was a kind of a couple of people that had, it might have been the Miss Diffies that had this cafe, and then they it was then taken over by Mr. Wood. And then when I was growing up, it was still a kind of paper shop and a kind of sweetie shop, and that was when it was Mr. and Mrs. Davis that had it. And Mr. Davis was a kind of local magician whose stage name was Joe D, and his wife, Mrs. Davis, was the assistant. And it was he was not a very good magician, I remember. And they used to have little fights on the stage at times. I remember, like, at some Whitman concerts and kind of local events, Mr. Davis would be there doing his magic with his wife Doris, not being particularly amused at the stuff that went wrong. So that was kind of back in the days when that's what passed for entertainment in West Linton at the weekend. But that shop's been through a kind of number of iterations. It's been a kind of, it was a chemist at one point, it's been a cafe, it's been a kind of just a bookshop and a sweetie shop, and now it's the post office. So it's a real kind of reuse and recycle type of shop. It's been through a kind of number of iterations. Can then moving a bit further up the village, we kind of get to where, again, it used to be a cafe. It's kind of on the edge. It used to be a school. If you look at it, there's kind of a, it's just before you go up, it's called Mobies Slap, named after the Mowbrays that had the woman that lived in the house, but they also lived in the Linton Hotel. And it's kind of on the corner. So if you look at the kind of picture there, there's a kind of couple of cars parked beside the road, and a kind of little, a couple of boys crossing, and just on the corner there you can see that there's it's a shop, and that's where the shop was. And that was a kind of, it's again been a kind of number of things over the years, but it's kind of started off as a kind of clothes and wool and sweetie shop basically, and it then became a cafe, and then a sweet shop as well. So very much kind of food orientated, but kind of mixing up kind of wool and clothes and sweets. It's quite a kind of I don't know, eclectic
is that where the
mixture.
Co-op is?
No, it's before the Co-op. It's the one on the other side of the road. If you're going out of the village, kind of there's a little lane goes up, and then just over there, it's now a house. It's beside the house called Rosetta, basically. So it's kind of on the corner. That used to be a school many years ago, and if you look up on the wall, there's a little kind of plaque thing, a kind of little carved thing, and that's where a school used to be. But then it's been a shop, and now it's become a house basically. So again, very much in the kind of sweetie cafe type thing. It's again, West Linton had a plethora of cafes basically, but that's what that's been as well. And then moving on from there, we then go on to the Co-op, and that's where on that picture there's some boys kind of standing out, there's some people standing outside the shop. That's been a kind of shop for many years. Again, it used to be kind of two shops. It used to be a kind of grocer's shop, and beside that it was originally the bank, and then it became the chemist before the chemist moved across the road. And then it got all incorporated into kind of the one shop by the Cooperative, basically Pennycook Cooperative run that for many years, and it used to have a kind of Drapers in it and everything like that. It was quite a kind of a shop with lots of stuff in it. I think now when you look at it, when I was small, I remember it having the Drapers where the tills are in the shop now, but I remember going through the Drapers and thinking it was massive, and looking at it now, it must have been like the tiniest shop in the world. But again, that's something that luckily I suppose for West Linton that has actually remained a shop, because it's one of the few shops that's actually remaining, and it's still run by the Co-op, and it's never really changed from being anything but a kind of it's always been a kind of food shop in there. That's what it's always been through its kind of iterations, and it's kind of gone almost full circle and back to kind of the Cooperative running it. The chemist, as I say, it's now moved across the road from where that used to be before it was taken over by another person. And quite interesting as well, like West Linton used to have its own telephone exchange in the village. So the house where you can see there's a bus stop, so that house behind on the bottom there at the bus stop, that used to be the telephone exchange. So that was the telephone exchange run by some people called the Horseboroughs, and that was there before the post office was basically the post office. Everything's just kind of moved about. The chemist used to be where the Co-op is, and then the chemist moved to where the chemist is now. Where the chemist is now used to be the post office, but that moved across the road to where Oxengate's Ashley House is now, and that became the telephone exchange in the post office. That's now a house, and that was kind of there for quite a few years. I think that's where the telephone exchange was. It was one of kind of real old-fashioned telephone exchange where I think people used to listen into your telephone calls and all that kind of thing. It was very kind of one of these manual ones, And that was there for years before the post office moved to another area in West Linton, basically. So again, it's just kind of like these buildings have gone out of kind of commercial use and become a house. That's now a house, a kind of Oxengates it's called, or Ashley House. It has about 6 different names, but that's kind of what that was as well. And then moving on from there up to next, there's a little lane goes up beside that set of buildings, and on that little lane there's this brick building, and that is actually a wash house where there used to be a kind of boiler and an you know, a big washing tub basically for people to do their washing. Now I'm not sure if that was just the wash houses for the houses next door, or whether that was a kind of public wash house. But again, within kind of living memory, that was kind of used by people to actually do their washing in West Linton, this kind of old-fashioned type wash house. So quite, looking at it, you wouldn't really know what it is now. There's nothing to really kind of tell you what it was, but it's quite an interesting relic from that kind of time. You can see the chimney from where the fire used to be to basically heat up the water. I think walking past it, you probably wouldn't know. It's just used as kind of sheds now for rubbish and stuff, or just for people putting in junk in sheds and stuff like that. But that's what that is. That's what that's been in West Linton, a kind of old-fashioned, well, not old-fashioned, I suppose at the time it was probably cutting edge, but now that's what it was. It was a kind of wash house area as well. Moving on from there, we're kind of into the kind of next set of shops, and this again was a set of kind of cafes and sweetie shops and butchers basically. We've got where the hairdressers is now. That used to be a cafe. That was run by Irene Holliday, who was my aunt basically, that years ago. Next door to that, there was another sweetie shop. I think I've got no idea how the people in West Linton at that time actually had any teeth. It was like between cafes, sweetie shops, newsagents selling sweets. It just seemed to be you could pretty much walk from one end of the village to the other without your feet touching the ground. You could walk over sweets everywhere. And then we've also got where this is relatively interesting, where the pie at Deli used to be a butcher. It was a butcher's. That is actually going to be a butcher's again. It's kind of almost gone full circle now. We've got we used to have a butcher's there for years and years. It was run by the Sinklers. That then became an office for a while. It was kind of bought out and split into houses, a house, and then became a small office. It then became a deli for a while. And now that's been bought back or re-rented as a butcher's. So there's going to be a butcher's coming back in. So that whole kind of thing is just kind of gone around this entire cycle. But again, very much kind of like being able to get stuff from within the village, having access to, you know, kind of like cafes, sweeties, butchers and all that kind of stuff in this area. So really kind of really thriving shopping area within the village. At that time. Then kind of going further up, going up towards kind of the top of the village, basically what I would call the top of the village, up to the Edinburgh end, there's a kind of row of small houses where the Red Cross shop used to be. It's now called the Knot, kind of low level houses. And in there, there was a person called Mr. Hughes who used to do cobbling or cobblers, is that what it's called? There's repair shoes, basically a shoe repairer, and that was actually quite common in West Linton. There was more than one person did shoe repairs. So there was Mr. Hughes who did it from his house. There was some steps that actually went under the house, although looking at it now, you would never know that these steps had been there. But my mother remembers going down these steps into a kind of little bit under the house, and that's where he did his shoe repairing. You can also see that Glenn Walter repaired shoes. There's a little kind of ditty there telling you why feet are the foundation of happiness, which has been taken out of the Whitman books. The Whitman books have been a a real kind of plethora of information about the kind of types of shops that were in the village at this time, kind of this 40s, 50s type era. So there was a shoe repairer there, and there was also a person that repaired shoes kind of further up the village, just somebody who had been a policeman who still lived in West Linton, and he also carried out shoe repairs. And I think it's quite interesting again that people, rather than just throwing away stuff, were actually getting it repaired, and that you could actually get it done within the village. That's something that you can't get done now. Mr. Hughes, he was another one of these multi-talented people, playing the piano and also the organ in the church in West Linton, because at this time in West Linton there was actually 3 churches. There's 2 now, but we had 3 churches at that point as well. Trinity Church was another one, which is now a house, but he was playing the piano in that house as well, in that church as well. So again, another kind of thing about just seeing how much was actually going on in the village as well, in terms of like what you could get done. Kind of moving a bit further up, this is when we kind of moved into things like, well, cakes and paint, basically a kind of another mixture of things. But there was a baker in the village, Hollidays, which is where the bakehouse restaurant is. So that's now it's opened up again as a restaurant, but at that time it was actually an actual bakehouse with stuff getting made on the premises. My mother, she works in there. She remembers it being absolutely infested with cockroaches and them getting swept up and thrown on the fire. So, but I don't know if there's that. I would imagine I think obviously now pest control is probably a bit better, but I think just having like the flour and all that on the premises, that's the type of thing that attracts lots of insects and stuff like that. So, but Hollidays was a kind of renowned baker in the village. They also had a van. Home deliveries and all that is very kind of the thing at the moment, but this was basically something that happened. Most people were doing it at this time, delivering stuff round about. So they did home deliveries, and they were the person. They also provided the tea and cakes for the dances. There was a lot of dancing going on in West Linton at that time, so there was dances nearly every weekend, either in Carlops, Newlands or West Linton. And Hollidays used to provide the half-time refreshments basically, and bring their buns along and that type of stuff for people to eat. So they were very much involved in the village life as well. And then we also had a painter and decorator, Mason Stevenson, who stayed in the kind of corner house on the Deanfoot Road, and just kind of also was stored his paint kind of in what is now houses. And I think again what it shows is, like, at that point a lot more of the kind of buildings and that in West Linton were given over to actual commercial use as opposed to houses, whereas now everything, or a lot of the stuff, is now houses rather than commercial use. There was also a Drapers in West, or a drapery business. So this business was based in where the bookshop is now, or used to be, Derek's bookshop. So that's on the corner of Deanfoot Road. There's a building there, and it's now a house, but that was a shop at that point. And that was owned by Daniel McPherson, whose hilarious sign was like, "McPherson's trousers down again, come in and see for yourself." This was apparently something that was once put in the window to kind of advertise his sale. Obviously creating great hilarity round about West Linton at that time about that kind of sign. That was he basically had a lot of he sold clothes in the village as well, so you could buy clothes in West Linton as well, a proper drapery business, a tailoring business. So that was being run out of there. Interestingly, I looked him up, and he actually came up from Dumfries to West Linton to set up the business. So it was clear that coming to West Linton was something that people would do, to actually set up businesses. It was a thriving area that you could actually set up and make a business viable. Because I've looked back some censuses and stuff like that, and there was a lot of movement round about West Linton in terms of people coming and going and coming into West Linton. Although there's been people here for a long time, they've not maybe been here for as long as people might imagine. That there's been a lot of movement of people coming in and out and taking over businesses and running things. So clearly there was a need for this kind of type of people to come in to actually run the businesses in West Linton, to actually service the community and give people the services that they needed. The other thing that you can see, I don't know how much you know about West Linton, but you can see there's a kind of, on the picture there's two standard stone standards with a gate with two balls on the top. That is actually where the school gates used to be into the school. Let's go into the next slide. So where these two balls, these two pillars are, that was the gate into the school. So the boys went in from one side into the old school, and the girls went in from the other side, and that was the girls' entrance into the school there. So it kind of ran up the side of the houses that are in that. There's a garden, a kind of stone walled garden, and that's where the girls went into the school from. And also there was a garage there as well, Lithgow's garage. It was laterally the Manor garage, but that was one of 3 garages in West Linton as well. We had 3 kind of garages actually in the village, servicing, I suppose, a lot of them had come from being blacksmiths for horses and stuff like that. So there was Smiddy, where the Smiddy houses are now. There was a garage there. There was Lithgow's garage just off this picture here, and then at the top of the village there was another garage, the Gordon Arms garage at the top of the village as well. Certainly the Smiddy was one where that had evolved basically from being a horse for shoeing horses into like doing cars as the horses had kind of stopped being used so much. But again, a thriving community requiring 3 garages to basically keep it going, all situated in the village. So just when you think, you're probably feeling quite weak by this point, that you get up to the top of the village and you think, I tell you what, I need some sweets, because it's at least 200 yards since I've seen my last sweet shop. So at the very kind of top of the village, there's a kind of, just before you turn the corner to go out up onto the high road, kind of if you go straight on, there's a kind of house there, and that used to have a shop in it. There's a kind of funny looking pavement, and there's a little bit goes in, and the little bit that went in, that's where the shop was. And I vaguely remember that shop. So that's, quite a few years ago now, but I vaguely remember that shop kind of in the 1970s, but I think it was probably on its last legs by then. And that was a kind of sweet shop, and that was also where the parcels got taken from the bus. So basically it's really near the bus stop. So it was one of these, it was a bit like your kind of, I don't know, bit like your Hermes depot, maybe not quite Hermes, not Hermes, but you know what I mean. It's where you could actually, your Amazon locker in a way. It was the Amazon locker of its day, where you could get something delivered out from Edinburgh, and it would basically come out in the bus, and it would get delivered there, and then you could go and pick it up when you could get it. So again, that was right at the top of the village, another sweet shop. So yeah, as I say, there's plenty of sweet shops in West Linton. Kind of coming up to the very, very top of the village. Now this is the high road, the road out to looking towards Edinburgh here, and this is where we had one of a garage and one of the pubs basically. So there was a Gordon Arms Hotel up here, and also the Gordon Arms garage, and they were owned by the McGregors over a number of years. And they were kind of involved in, well, basically running the garages and doing the pubs. They also gave the land. I don't know if the Graham Yule Memorial at the top of the village. There's a memorial to a doctor called Dr. Graham Yule. So they donated the land for that memorial there to be built on, because Dr. Graham Yule died at a very early age, and he was a very kind of he was a doctor in the village before the NHS became, well, before the NHS was set up. But he was a doctor that basically he doctored to everybody, whether they could afford to pay or not. So when he met his kind of early death, the people of West Linton, you know, they wanted to put a memorial up to him. So there's a kind of stoned area up there where it's a kind of seating area, paved area, and you can sit there. It's kind of fallen into some disrepair in the last kind of few years, but we've got a grant now from the council to do it up, so we're hoping to kind of get it refurbished a bit and do that up as well. So that land was donated to the village by the McGregors to put that memorial on.
So
there was also, sorry,
I suppose those cars are going at the same speed we have to go now.
Probably, I would imagine so. Yeah. The speed that you're meant to go at through West Linton, but not the speed that people do go at through West Linton. There was also a cafe up there. So when you come into West Linton now on the bus, at the bus stop, there's a 3-storey house behind the bus stop, and that used to be where the post office was. So when I was growing up, that's where the post office was, right at the top of the village, and that's where the post office moved to once the telephone exchange got shut down. It moved up there. It then got, before that, it had been a cafe, and it was a cherry tree cafe at the bus stop, and that was what it was used for there. And it was run by a person called Mrs. Malcolm, who run the cafe. It then became the post office, and now it had an extra story added onto it, and then it became a house, and it's been a house for, I don't know, probably quite a few years now, many years, 30, 40 years probably. So it's again, it's another one of these things that's had quite a few iterations in the village. Coming back down, we're going to come back down the other side of the main street now. We kind of had 2 plumbers in West Linton. So we had the Walter family came to West Linton many years ago, and they were they were plumbers basically. So we had our Walter and we had Richard Walter, who were related. I think they might even have been father and son, but I think at some point there was an argument or something like that, and a parting of the ways. So we got rival plumbing firms set up, and they were related as well to Glenn Walter, who did your shoes for you further down the village. So very much keeping things in the family, and you know, people just doing what they thought they could, you know, do to make some money. But yeah, you can see here that we've got a couple of plumbers, and what's quite interesting is that Ellie's Land and Hawthorne Bank are practically next door to each other in West Linton. I mean, they must have, like, although they were setting up rival businesses, they must have had to pass each other on the way out to the vans in the morning, basically. So quite amusing, maybe not. A bit further down, we get to the Linton Hotel. So this is another one of the pubs in West Linton. So we had 3 pubs with the Gordon Arms at the top of the village, and then the Linton Hotel. The Linton Hotel was owned by the Mowbrays, and that's a relation of the Maggie Mowbray that ended up living in the small, what is now the garage, basically. Quite a kind of sad tale, I think. I think there was a bit of a somebody died, her father died, and things like that. And I think the kind of Linton Hotel got sold on, and she didn't get any money out of it, and ended up practically destitute, even although you know, at the time when they were all, when she was younger, she'd lived, you know, in the Linton Hotel, which was doing well, or lived, her parents had ran the Linton Hotel and they'd lived nearby. But I think after that, the Mowbrays had it and it was sold on. It became run by somebody called Jimmy Oliver, who you can see had the Hygeeks Sillerite system, which had no lead in it, which was clearly a selling point for your beer pumping system in the 1950s or 60s when this advert was, and also had a 7-day license, which, thinking, you know, now with the kind of opening hours and that of pubs and that, it's quite quaint that people actually put that stuff on, and that was a kind of selling point. But the Linton Hotel was probably one of the better pubs in West Linton, and it had a nice beer garden. But again, that's all been sold off now. It's flats and houses now, and that's another thing that's been kind of lost to West Linton. Next to the pub, there's a kind of small kind of building. It's just attached straight onto the pub, and that used to be Jockey Lamb's hairdressing salon or room, and he had quite a reputation in West Linton as somebody who, if you looked in and he looked a bit unsteady, you probably didn't want to get your hair cut that day. You probably wanted to come back when he maybe wasn't quite as unsteady. And but I think some of the tales are probably a bit apocryphal and maybe a bit exaggerated. I think he was a bit of a drinker, but I think probably some of them are a bit exaggerated. He was also a kind of talented musician. My mother remembers him playing outside his shop when it wasn't busy, and he once ran a dance in aid of himself, but wasn't allowed to keep the money. He had to donate it to charity. I'm not exactly sure why he needed to run the thing for himself, but anyway, he did, and he wasn't allowed to keep it to charity. But he wasn't allowed to keep it; he had to donate it to charity. And apparently, when Yule Brynner was all the rage, he shaved his head as well to kind of like keep up with the trends of having no hair or something like that. So he was quite an a kind of local character, as it were. Everybody knew him, but he was the kind of main barber or hairdresser in West Linton. And I think when it was hard to get out, Mum remembers getting some good haircuts, but equally she remembers getting some real crackers as well that you probably wouldn't want to have any pictures of. We then kind of go down to, slightly further on. There's an opening into a bit called Linton Bank. So Linton Bank used to be a farm, and that was based right in the middle of West Linton. So the Linton Bank farm used to extend really quite far in West Linton. It was a large farm. And if you kind of go out, if you go up the School Brae, there's a road off the School Brae, and that's called Linton Bank Drive. And I used to wonder why it's called Linton Bank Drive, because it's absolutely miles away from Linton Bank. Not miles, but it's quite far away from Linton Bank. But that was a kind of extent of the farmland, and a lot of that land where the school was built on, round about Linton Bank Drive, all the way down towards Deanfoot Farm, that was all that land. At this point where in the kind of 40s, 50s, 60s, that land had already been built on, and it was just really down to the steading within the village, but it wasn't being run as a farm anymore. It was just kind of run by a joinery business, but there's still kind of pockets of land for that farm round about West Linton. So the Chapel Brae in West Linton, there's a house, there's a couple of houses in the field opposite the church on the Chapel Brae, and that's land that's owned by the Ketchens, who used to live in Linton Bank. And I remember when I was young there, they used to have greenhouses in there to grow tomatoes, and they also had hens in there as well. So again, it was the kind of remnants of the farm buildings and all that, or just the farmer being using the land basically to grow stuff. And again, we had a couple of joinery businesses in West Linton based right in the village. We had the Stevens joinery business on what's now Croft Road, and then Linton Bank, where there was also joinery business ran out of there. So again, it's quite interesting that, you know, we had all that stuff in West Linton. It's now, we've still got it, but it's not based in the kind of the same area. Coming further down, we've got Groceries, where the Fireside shop now is. That used to be a grocer's shop, and that was one of about 4 grocer's shop in West Linton, because there was the Co-op. There used to be a grocer's shop where the bookshop was. There was a grocer's shop there for a while. There was a grocer's shop where Slimming shop used to be, the fruit shop. That was also used to sell groceries as well latterly. And then we had this one, Archibald's, or Patterson's as well as it was called. So it started off with Mr. Archibald and then became Patterson's. Oh no, it was Patterson's and then Archibald's. And that's run as a grocery shop. There was also a kind of petrol pump at there if you look at the valuation rules. But again, it's unclear whether that was just used for the vans for the shop or not, or whether it was actually selling petrol. Again, you can see that it had a lot of stuff in the shop, that it supplied a lot of different things. It had you know, frozen goods, it had cakes, it had ironmongery. I do remember it being an ironmonger. She'd get bits and pieces in there. And again, it was kind of, it also did deliveries. So another one that did deliveries in the West Linton. There was also a grocery van that just went round. It wasn't tied to a shop, and that was run by somebody called Robert Small. And there was a big joke about him about Bobby's bus. So he had a bus. It was effectively a bus that he filled up with stuff and then drove round to places. And the thing about Bobby's bus was that you never knew when it was going to turn up, because Bobby kept quite eclectic hours. And so there was a kind of panto one year in West Linton, and one of the songs was, it's 8:30, it's getting late, but it's early for Bobby's bus, because Bobby's bus used to turn up at 10:30 at night, I think, you know, to sell you your groceries. And quite funnily, one of my friends who lives in Loch Gilphead, her father, who's now dead, he lived in Edinburgh, but he used to come out to the huts that used to be at Carlops. They used to come out in the summer. People used to come out and live in the huts in the summer holidays. And I remember visiting in Loch Gilphead and speaking to him. And once he knew I was from West Linton, one of the first things he said to me was, "Did you know about Bobby's bus?" And he knew all about Bobby's bus, because I think he obviously, when he was younger, was sitting around till like 10:30 at night waiting for Bobby's bus to come to deliver some food for them to eat for their tea or something like that. Moving a bit further down the village, we're going to the Remartin Square. So the Remartin Square was the kind of other pub in the village. For a while, it was run by the Miss Diffeys, who ran it as a temperance hotel, and it was a temperance hotel for quite a while. There was another temperance hotel in Carlops as well. So if you were a non-drinker, you were actually catered for quite well in the West Linton area. That was it's obviously not that, it's houses now. Again, it's been turned into houses, and it's, I think by the kind of 40s, 50s, the temperance stuff was over, and it was a pub, basically being run as a pub. What's quite interesting in that area of West Linton is that there used to be it's almost now called the Remartin Square, but there's a bit that used to be called Ritchie Place. So there used to be a bit that was actually called Ritchie Place, which is kind of behind where the paper shop is now. There's a kind of load of houses in there off the Remartin Square, which that used to be called Ritchie Place. And opposite the Remartin Square, there's Cameron Square. And if you look at one of the houses, kind of on the it's the left-hand side looking up, there's a frieze, and that's actually of this person called James Ritchie, who obviously Ritchie Place was named after. I don't actually know who he was. He was obviously some kind of maybe wealthy person who had something named after him, but that's just a name that's actually fallen out of use absolutely in West Linton. It's something that's not used anymore. But again, that's only fallen out of use within the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years, say, because somebody that my mum knows, who used to live in Ritchie Place, she called it Ritchie Place, but nobody even knows about that now. So it's quite interesting as well about how quickly these kind of place names just go out of fashion if people aren't using them. So we're kind of down at the paper shops now. So the paper shop there's been owned by not lots of people over the years. That's always been a paper shop there. It's always been that kind of paper shop, fancy goods type shop. That's kind of what it's been for many, many years in the village. And then back down to kind of where we started. So in this picture here, the house with the children standing outside it, that actually used to be the police station in West Linton. So it's actually called the old police station. And that was opposite Slimming's shop. And one of the things that Agnes Slimming told me, that she remembers Reid Meikle, who became a police officer, I believe, in the Borders. She used to remember him coming into the shop when he was small, kind of messing about and hanging about at the fire and giving them a kind of rendition of What Shall We Do with the Drunken Sailor. And that was quite amusing just to hear that, because it's quite, a lot of people kind of knew Reid Meikle, and to kind of think about him when he was that age, kind of coming in and showing off basically, and probably getting a biscuit from the Slimmings as well for doing it, and coming into the shop and doing that. It was quite a kind of little interesting, just a bit of social history that, you know, the type of thing that gets forgotten. So that's kind of it now. That's the kind of our walk up and down the main street at West Linton. I would say that when I was looking at this, I hadn't really realised what a kind of thriving place West Linton actually was. There was loads of cafes, grocers, sweeties. There was actually a sweetie shop. So there was actually a dentist, which I think most people would be probably quite thankful for, given the number of sweet shops in the West Linton. But we had everything. There was garages, plumbers, electrician, joiner. There was an undertaker, hairdresser. You know, you could get wool, haberdashery, tailor, market garden, bakers. Lots of delivery vans, pubs, paper shop, ironmongery, chemist and a doctor. There was a bus service that went right through West Linton. There was much better connectivity now. There was a bus that came right up from Peebles and came right through, as you can see from like the bus stops and that on the village, on the main street. And then we had, you know, fire station, churches, boarding houses. And really the only thing that was missing was a fish shop, but I think the fish got delivered from a van once or twice a week. So it's kind of quite, looking back, there was lots more going on in West Linton, I think, in terms of like being self-sufficient and actually being able to get stuff in the village, whereas now it's very much all having to go out. But yeah, it was quite interesting just to go and look at that and find out what was going on. And I hope you've not found it too bad, you know, me talking about West Linton and all the places that you maybe don't know that well, and that you found it quite interesting. So thanks for listening anyway.
I'll just stop you sharing the screen, and then I can put on so we can see everybody.
That's very interesting.
Dark.
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for Angela? One of the things I was wondering was, what was the population of West Linton in the 40s and 50s?
I think it was probably round about 500 or 600 people. I mean, at the moment,
a lot of city shops, so it's about,
yeah, I think probably even less than that. So I think officially the population is only a couple of thousand now, and so I think you're probably talking maybe 500 or so people. I think. I mean, I also kind of looked at another thing about kind of what was going on, and I think, I don't know whether it was just the fact that there wasn't much in the way of like tellies, or, you know, that it was a very thriving place and had a lot of stuff going on in terms of like what you could get and what you could do, and it seemed to do a lot with what it had. Basically, there was a lot going on and a lot of people doing a lot of different things, and you know, there was some very large families, but there was, you know, people doing lots of different things, and as I say, people moving into West Linton to actually take shops on and stuff like that. So, you know, clearly a large enough population to keep these things going.
And looking at the number of boarding houses and the fact that you had a rail service as well, I guess you probably had people coming from Edinburgh, because I know Biggar was a bit of a tourist destination, coming from Edinburgh, and I guess it would have been the same in West Linton for, you know, day out and fresh air.
Definitely. I mean, my I think it's my granny on my father's side. They ran boarding houses, so really, like, in terms of like you know, some of the big houses in West Linton, they had lived in most of them and ran them as boarding houses, and there was a lot of people boarded teachers and things like that boarded during the week, but there was a lot of boarders who boarded full time in West Linton. So clearly there was a market for that, as well as it being quite a popular tourist destination. And yeah, I've got quite a lot of collection of postcards from West Linton as well. And that's quite funny as well. Some of the things are like weather not as bad as expected and stuff like that. So I don't know what the kind of stuff that has been said about it, but I think it was quite a day trip place, definitely, from people from like Edinburgh and things like that. But two, there was people coming here for holidays, definitely for like a week or so at a time as well. So there was a thriving industry around that.
Even longer. My father's family, for at least 2 generations, 3 generations, used to come out from Edinburgh, and various other businessmen from Edinburgh, and they would rent houses in West Linton for the summer and be there for 2 to 3 months. And my grandfather and my great-grandfather would go into business during the week, but the family would stay there. And I suppose the most recent, the ones that the Abbeys, who used to live on the top road, were amongst the people who this was life for a particular group of people in Edinburgh, and they'd come out to play golf, to walk the hills, and also to enjoy the social life in West Linton. Yeah,
I think there was quite a lot. I mean, Weston had its fair share of probably quite wealthy people. You know, there was people like the Miss Abbeys. There was Miss Downs from Greensmith Downs' shop in Edinburgh as well. We had Lord Guthrie, who was a a judge, and there was quite a number of people that were probably, getting the best of both worlds, in that they were working in Edinburgh or had rich relations in Edinburgh, but had the access to the countryside and the nice countryside round about West Linton, but were able to get back into Edinburgh quite easily.
Yeah, there were more than one parrot in West Linton.
Was there?
The Abbeys, yes, the Abbeys had a parrot, and it was their brother's parrot that he brought and left with them. And he was a seafaring man, and he used to swear. When I used to visit, he was usually covered with a cloth because he wouldn't say anything. So my delight used to be to take the cloth off so that the parrot would swear.
Can you remember what he said, though?
Just filthy seaman language. I don't remember the Abbeys having. The word was so much, but an awful lot of bloodies.
I don't remember the Abbeys having a parrot. I remember them being really generous if you went to get sponsors.
Kind people, yes.
Yeah, and my mother remembers that when her brother used to do Bob a Job, he used to go up to the Abbeys every year to clean the brass on the stair rods or something.
Yes, yeah.
And they used to give him, it wasn't, he used to make an absolute fortune by cleaning their brass, and they used to keep it for him to do basically each year. Yes. So although they were obviously wealthy and had that big house, they were very kind of generous to the community as well. They
also had a house in Inverleith Row as well. Yeah. So in the winter, the family and their parents and grandparents before used to split their dwelling between the 2 places, between West Linton and their house in Inverleith Row.
Yeah.
So yeah, all the time that you were talking, I thought, when's she going to mention the fact that there are all these Edinburgh people coming out, which must have helped with the economy of the time.
I think as well, West Linton was quite lucky because stuff like the community centre where Line Park is now, so that was the Pant House for a while as well, but that community centre was donated to West Linton to use by Major Thompson. And he was another extremely wealthy person who was also extremely generous as well, donating stuff like the land for the bowling green and stuff like that. So again, I think West Linton was lucky in that there was people that were yeah, both wealthy and generous and community minded as well, to kind of allow that kind of stuff to happen. Because certainly the community centre for years was one of the big things in West Linton that people went to, and was a real kind of thriving place as well, to kind of do things at. And there was a lot of stuff going on there in terms of like pantos and just generally people getting together and stuff like that. So there was quite a lot going on. I kind of gathered that information together in another kind of talk as well about just kind of things that there was to do. But you know, there was a thriving.
Do let me know when you give the talk, because
well, I can do that one as well. I've got I wouldn't share all my secrets, but you know, there was there was a lot going on in West Linton as well in terms of dancing and stuff like that. So
and golf.
And yeah, golf. There was lots going on basically as well. So it's definitely an area where yeah, there was a small number of people, but a lot going on. But I think, you know, if I was going to relate it to somewhere like currently, my friend stays in Loch Gilphead, which is basically the back of beyond, and it has an absolutely thriving community because it's really hard to get out and do things. You know, they're very cut off in a way, and I think probably that's what West Linton was like in the that kind of mid-century, before buses and cars became really popular. It was quite cut off to a certain extent, so people had to do their own things. They had to generate their own, you know, the stuff had to be available for people to buy and all that in West Linton. And I think that's how it managed to support so many shops. And I just think it's quite ironic now that that's what everybody wants, but all the premises that you could put that stuff into now have been sold and made into houses, and there's just not available anymore, which is the kind of irony of the whole situation, that people move into villages and want all these services, but they're actually living in the thing that would have provided the service at some point. But that's another talk probably.
Can I ask, when did the Smiddies housing get built?
That was probably in the 90s, I think, probably the late 80s, 90s. When I was at the school, that was a garage, or the primary school, and then I remember that, and then so I think it's probably the late 80s that became houses.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was a bit hard to tell, you know, with the style of the wooden frames and window frames.
Yeah, I think they're certainly older than, it's not the 2000s. I would say it was probably the 80s, 90s that they were built round about then. I think they've probably been up for about maybe 30 years, 25 to 30 years, I would say. So it's that kind of time scale.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask, the McGregors who donated the money for the quiet area, are they the roofers now?
Yes, so they're still McGregor. So they're all called Gregor basically. Well, they're not all called Gregor, but the first son of the McGregors is always called Gregor. So there's lots of Gregor McGregors, but yes, they are still, they're still builders and doing stuff like that. I don't know if they're Slaters. They do definitely do building work. The Slaters and that tend to be the Smalls. They tend to do a lot of roofing work as well. The Smalls, so Robert Small, Eric Small, Alistair Small, they were tending to do the roofers, roofing stuff. And they were related to Bobby of the bus fame, Bobby's Bus. So they didn't go into the grocery business, they went into the roofing business instead.
Did they not have a bric-a-brac shop?
That was Jock Small, yes. Yeah. So that was Bobby's Bus Small's brother. Yes. He had he was basically, we buy junk and sell antiques. That was his thing. In the Whitman book. Which, I don't know how much that would make you want to go in and buy anything, but anyway, so he used to have where the bakehouse is, there's a little lane beside it, and on the other side of that there's a bit there, it's a house now, but that used to be a kind of shop for the junk and stuff, the antiques basically. That was where he had his kind of stuff was in there. Yes, but yes, he did.
We lived in Harriet Cottage for a few years, around 1970.
Right.
So he was there then.
Yeah. I remember he once did this thing. I remember it was in the Whitman week. He dressed up as Pope Jock the first and last or something. I mean, you probably couldn't even get away with it now. And
Yeah.
there was a bus trip coming down through the village when they were doing their I'm laughing about it. I remember it when they were doing their kind of march thing through the village, their procession. And I think by that point a fair amount of alcohol had been imbibed, and he got on the bus and blessed it all. Dressed up as the Pope.
Very good.
I don't think you'd be allowed to do that now. It was quite funny though. I do remember that. So, but yeah, that was him. He had that. So yeah, that was the heady days of the 1970s.
Local entrepreneur.
Yeah,